to the Honeystead podcast. My name is Kaylee, and I'm a beekeeper, herbalist, and a modern-day homesteader trying to shine a little light of encouragement for others to not be afraid, to get their hands dirty, and of course, learn something old. What's going on, guys, and welcome to the Honeystead podcast. This is episode number 2, and I'm calling this one the Golden Horseshoe and Trigger. Now, I've got a story that I want to share with you guys because a lot of people ask me. A lot of people ask how I started into beekeeping, and really, that's a beautiful story. It's a fun story. It's a lot of my childhood. I had a horse growing up, and her name was Trigger. She was probably one of the ugliest horses in the pasture, but she was mine. And as a kid growing up with a horse, there's something that you cannot describe that type of love. I know if many of you guys grew up having horses, you guys probably know what I'm talking about. But if you didn't, it's kind of like the same relationship that you had with your dog. You know, they're big dogs. That's what we called them. Our horses were big dogs. But Trigger and I go way back. And I'm telling you guys this story because I'm currently sitting up here in the apothecary looking at the gift that my husband and my father made for me this past Christmas. I have to start with Trigger. I've got to tell you about her. She was an old nurse mare, and we don't exactly know what she was. I think that she had a little bit of Appaloosa in her, maybe quarter horse Appaloosa, but she was perfect for a kid, and she sure did have the patience for me. I was a little bit wild, and she hung right there with me, except for one day when I was running right beside her in the pasture. For some reason, she did not like that, and I have never seen a horse do a cattle kick, but she hauled off and cattle kicked me right in the center of my chest. I had the perfect shoe mark on my white t-shirt. She definitely knocked the wind out of me, and one story that I don't think I'll ever forget. But Trigger was really a good horse, and there are so many stories that I had growing up with her. Now, we didn't own the property that we kept our horses on. It was about 3,000 acres. I think 1,000 of it was fenced in, nestled right at the bottom of the mountain where I grew up at. And so my mom and I would go in the morning and in the evening, and we would take care of the horses. We would brush them, we would grain them, we would tend to them, we would clean their hooves, we would ride them. I mean, it was every day. I smelt like a horse, you know that smell when you're around an animal, you start to smell like that animal. I feel like I probably smelled like a horse my whole childhood. The gentleman that actually used to maintain the entire property, he came up to me and he told me, he said, now Kaylee, I want you to know that you can't go over on this side of the property. I want you to be very careful. And he explained to me why. There was a beekeeper that was leasing the land, and he had rows and rows of hives. And he said, you need to be very cautious about riding your horse over there. You don't need to be near there. Well, I think I was probably about 7 or 8, and I, again, being the feral child that I was, and still am inside, I didn't listen. Of course not. Who's going to listen? And so one day I jumped on Trigger's back and I rode over to where he told me that the beehives were. And I'm going to tell you, I immediately fell in love. There's this time of day called the golden hour, and it's when the sun is at that perfect height in the sky, and it leaves this ray of gold. And so I'm sitting up on the hillside looking kind of down, because how it worked, like the trail was, it's kind of, think 2 hillsides. The trail that I was on was a little bit higher up, and then it dipped down, and then it went back up kind of on a more flatter hillside. So the bees were actually kind of going more towards the direction where I was. But the sun was just setting so perfectly where he had the bees, where he had all of his hives. And I just remember sitting on Trigger's back and looking at what I thought was complete and total magic. You could literally see the sun glistening on the wings of the bees, and I fell completely in love. It looked like a fairy tale. It looked like glitter. I mean, who doesn't? If you were 7, 8 years old and you're looking at something like that, how can you not think of it being so magical? And so I think that was probably what really piqued my interest in being a beekeeper later in life. It was always a goal of mine. I just didn't realize that it was going to be like this. And so I sat on Trigger's back and I would watch the bees, and I just completely fell in love. I fell in love. And then every once in a while when the beekeeper was there, I would go and I would peek, and he was an older gentleman. And I would watch him light a smoker. I'd watch him suit up, and it was just so fascinating. I don't think he ever saw that I was watching, but I was always kind of one of those peeping, I don't want to say peeping Tom, but I was always watching whenever I had an opportunity. And I noticed as the years had gone by and the older that I got, there were less and less hives. And so it kind of crushed me because that was something that I enjoyed. And so I knew one day that I was going to become a beekeeper. And well, here I am. I am a beekeeper. We've got over, I think it's 28 hives that I have right now. We had to consolidate a few of our hives, being that it's winter time, but coming into spring, I have a feeling, fingers crossed with everything that's happening, hopefully I will be splitting all of our colonies, and growing in numbers, of course, and then the swarm catches, but that's a whole nother story that we'll talk about. So, Trigger, back to my horse. There were stories that I had growing up that my mom and I would get our horses together. She had a beautiful Belgian draft named Fanny because, well, of course, her rear end was quite large. So it was the perfect name, okay, Fanny. That's, it is what it is. But we would put our saddles on our horses and we would just take off and ride through the trails. Now, mind you, the property where we leased our horses were at the bottom of the mountain that I grew up at. And there was main roads that we could ride on, gravel roads, not really main roads. But every once in a while on the beautiful warm summer days, my mom and I would go and take our horses to the lake, and see, nobody was there, and it was the perfect lake to swim in. And so we would take the saddles off of the horses and we would hop on the backs of the horses. And if you've never gone swimming with a horse, it is the craziest feeling, because as soon as the horse gets in the water, you think this big, massive animal would just kind of sink, but they float. And then they start swimming. And it's like you and the horse are completely weightless and you're swimming. And I don't know, I just love it. I absolutely love it. Probably one of the best childhood memories that I had. We would take our break at the lake, and then, of course, we would let them graze. We would dry off. As soon as the horses would dry off, we would have our lunch too. After we would dry off, we would saddle back up and we would ride around my childhood home and the trails there. And up near my childhood home, there was an apple orchard that we had permission that we could ride on. And so we would take our horses to the apple orchard. And I'm telling you what, Trigger, my horse, she was great. I remember I could just see her eyes when she would see the apples. And it was like, she wanted them. And so I would make her walk over to where the apple tree was. And I would stand up on the back of the saddle. And I would reach up and I would grab the biggest apple that I could possibly find. And I would take a bite out of it. And she would look back at me like, excuse me, would you share? So then I would lean my hand down, and of course she would take a big bite out of it. And her and I, that was our thing. We would go up and share apples. Not that many apples, of course, but maybe one or two. And we did this many times. And I don't exactly remember what day this happened, but I remember one time when we brought our horses back down to the farm, when we rode all the way back down. We took their saddles off, took their halter off, and we would do a nice, beautiful brush. We would assess them, clean their hooves. Well, one time during that adventure, during our rides, Trigger threw a shoe. I never found the shoe, and it was, it is what it is. So fast forward to this past year. I shared this past year that my parents were putting my childhood home up on the market. And so my husband and I and my family, we all kind of came together on remodeling my childhood home and cleaning up the trails that were there. And so as we were going through the trails, I looked down, and sure enough, there was Trigger's horseshoe. I lost it. I cried because the year that my husband and I got married, now mind you, Trigger was an old mare, but the year that my husband and I got married, my horse, we had to make the decision to go ahead and put her down. She was too old and she couldn't eat. She lost all of her teeth, and it just, it was her time. She was a good girl. And so I'm sitting in the trail with her horseshoe, and every single memory bubble that I had with my horse came back. This was back in the summer when this happened, when I found the horseshoe. And so I put the horseshoe in my husband's truck, wanting to bring it home because I wanted to do something with it. That was Trigger. That was her shoe. And then I forgot about it. Well, Christmas came around. This is the type of person that my husband is. He doesn't forget things. And his gifting capability is he is the ultimate gifter, the most thoughtful gifter. Well, Christmas morning, we're opening presents, and a lot of the presents that were given with thought, with love. He gives me this box. I open it up, and it's this beautiful cookie cut. It's like the round cut of a black walnut log, and he had planed it down, and he did an epoxy pour over top of it, and then planed it down. And right in the center of it was a beautiful gold painted horseshoe that my dad painted. And I'm sitting here looking at it as I'm sharing this story with you guys, because we have it hanging in the apothecary. And every time I look at it since Christmas, I teared up so many times because I wanted to share the story, but I didn't know how to share it without being a bawling baby. But that's okay. But Trigger was a good horse, and she was a huge part of my childhood and growing up, and has also made me, part of who I am today. And I will definitely forever remember these memory bubbles with her. Looking back at it now, I don't think that it was ironic that I found her shoe on the trail as we were cleaning it up to say goodbye to the property. I was experiencing every single flood of emotion at that time. And if anyone has ever sold a childhood home, I'm sure you understand what I'm experiencing. But I had walked those trails for years, and I never once found it. When my husband and I were on the trail, I looked down just out of the blue, and there it was, right there, plain sight. It was a little easier to have a little piece that I could take back home with me. And I know it's just an object, but the gift that I was able to receive was all the memories. And that's the only thing that I can take with me. And it's a story. And I get to share it. Growing up, I was always a finder. I was always finding something. Crazy rocks, shark's teeth, crystals, things that most people don't look at. But I did. I took the time to sit and look. And sometimes when you look past at what everyone else is looking at, you'll see what you're supposed to find. I've got a whole story of things that I have found throughout my life, and I'll probably share them with you. One of them is currently hanging in my kitchen, actually, and I'll have to save that story for another day. I think one of the biggest lessons that I've learned from my childhood, and something that I still practice to this day, is to stop and to find one thing that is beautiful in that day and appreciate it. Give thanks, show gratitude, and share it with somebody that you love. Thank you guys for listening, and as always, don't be afraid to get your hands dirty and learn something old. We'll see you next time on episode number 3 for the Honeystead podcast. Bye, guys.